Hi, I'm Frank Gavin, Director of the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at SAIS Johns Hopkins. What role will nuclear weapons play in world politics in the years to come? How should the United States adapt how it employs nuclear weapons in its grand strategy in the decades ahead? How might new technologies that have recently emerged and will continue to appear, especially in the digital realm, affect the central role the bomb has played in international relations since 1945? These questions are both fundamental and difficult to answer. Novel warfighting technologies emerge all the time. Throughout history, new capabilities have appeared to great acclaim, only to have their impact on the battlefield be less than anticipated. Other technologies unexpectedly offer surprise asymmetric, nonlinear effects that have profound consequences on the balance of power. Predictions on this front have often been misleading or even mistaken. Nuclear weapons and the technologies around them offer a particular challenge. We often know the impact of a technology on the balance of power only after it has been used and adapted on the battlefield. The bomb, thank goodness, has only been detonated during conflict just twice, within days of each other, when the Americans dropped atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Even nuclear crises have been rare in the early years of the Cold War competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. Even without being used, however, nuclear weapons have had a profound impact on questions of war and peace. The precise nature of how and why the bomb has shaped international affairs is widely debated. Arguably, the most important feature of nuclear weapons is their non-use and the consequences of their non-use. This quality is the most profound difference between the bomb and other military capabilities. Perhaps the most important assessment to make is how will these new technologies, as well as other factors, influence whether the bomb is more or less likely to be used in the future. For many decades, analysts have described, advocated for, and praised strategic stability, the situation in which nuclear weapons provide the benefits of deterrence without generating incentives for first use. While the idea of strategic stability is not without its own controversy, a key question to explore is whether or not various factors, including new technologies, cause nuclear weapons to be seen as more or less usable in the future. This talk will attempt to make sense of the complex issues surrounding the future of nuclear weapons. First, I will offer a brief overview of the history of nuclear weapons and highlight their unique qualities. I will also discuss the concept of strategic stability. Second, I will touch upon technological developments, both within and outside of the nuclear realm, with an eye towards assessing their effect on international relations. Third, I will offer thoughts about how we might think about and frame the role technology plays on grand strategy and world politics. What makes nuclear weapons unique among military capabilities? And will they retain these unique capabilities and aspects into the future? Three characteristics about nuclear weapons stand out compared to military technologies from the past. First, the level of potential destruction and death unleashed by nuclear weapons is extraordinary. Conventional strategic bombing and even land battles have generated enormous casualties in the past. Once thermonuclear devices were created in the early 1950s, however, no known technology could approach the power of nuclear weapons to level whole societies. Second, nuclear weapons radically compress the amount of time for delivering such devastation. Far lesser amounts of damage that would take years to inflict could now be surpassed and delivered in hours and even minutes. Third, such power could be delivered at great distances from the battlefield by dropped planes or missiles launched from the land, air, or sea. Nuclear war, unlike battles of the past, would be devastating, sudden, and could be carried out from great distances. It took some time before the consequences of nuclear weapons were understood. Most military technologies are assessed by whether they provided advantages to either the attacker or the defender, or whether it was what scholars call offense or defense dominant. Many technologies can be both, depending on how they're used. The tank, for example, or aircraft carriers. Different analysts suggested different answers at different times. Some say that nuclear weapons aided the offensive, whereas others say it provided defense with the advantage. Nuclear weapons, over time it became clear, created a third category, deterrence dominance. The leading school of thought on nuclear weapons posited that the bomb revolutionized international politics, making wars between nuclear weapon states inconceivable. Leading scholars, including Kenneth Waltz, Steve Van Evera, Charlie Glaser, and especially Robert Jervis, were the most important advocates of this perspective. According to them, the major quality of the technology was, for those who possess nuclear weapons and can protect them from a surprise attack, its ability to make any enemy think twice before attacking it. In other words, atomic weapons acted as invasion insurance. What states would acquire this technology, and under what circumstances? Could anything be done to stop the spread of nuclear weapons to new states? And once a state acquired the bomb, how many weapons and in what configurations and postures would be ideal? The Nuclear Revolution School had answers for all three questions. Given that a state possesses survivable nuclear weapons is more or less, given that a state that possesses survivable nuclear weapons is more or less invasion-proof, these weapons should have been very popular amongst states. The technology developed in the mid-1940s should not have been out of the reach of dozens of developed countries in the decades that followed. Given their power and appeal, one would have expected many states to acquire the bomb. Furthermore, efforts to stop the spread of nuclear weapons should have been very difficult, if not impossible. There are few examples of successfully stopping the spread of a military technology, especially one as effective in guaranteeing a state's security and survival as nuclear weapons. Surprisingly, however, both of these predictions were found wanting. As of today, only 9 states possess nuclear weapons. This number is far lower than most intelligence analysts or scholars would have predicted. Many states who had the capability to build the bomb, ranging from Australia to Sweden, explored nuclear weapons programs, but ultimately took a pass. A large reason for this lower than expected number were the non-proliferation efforts of the United States, or what I have called elsewhere, strategies of inhibition. The United States used a variety of tools, ranging from coercive threats against states seeking the bomb to establishing norms. It even worked with its bitterest enemy, the Soviet Union, to prevent its friends, such as West Germany and Japan, from getting nuclear weapons. It's also negotiated a series of treaties whose centerpiece was the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Arguably, the most successful tool the United States has deployed to limit proliferation has been to offer alliances and security guarantees. States ranging from South Korea to Italy to West Germany would receive protection under America's nuclear umbrella so long as they stayed non-nuclear themselves. How many weapons would a nuclear weapon state need, and in what configuration? The Nuclear Revolution School posited that all a state needed was a survivable nuclear force that could unleash unimaginable damage upon an adversary, even if it was attacked first. While there were debates over what this number was, or, quote, how much was enough, unquote, the basic logic was that after a certain point, additional nuclear weapons did not necessarily increase the military power a state possessed. This was another area where the Nuclear Revolution School's predictions came up short. If all that a state needed was a survivable nuclear force, the United States and the Soviet Union should have stopped building new forces at some point in the 1960s. Yet both countries poured hundreds of billions of dollars into nuclear weapon systems. Ironically, Even after the signing of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 1972, both sides continued to develop new nuclear technologies. They did not build necessarily more bombs, but rather weapons that could be targeted more accurately, approach the enemy more stealthily, and escape any possible defense. These types of weapon systems only made sense if they were used to target the other side's nuclear weapons or to be used preemptively. Much of the new and expensive technology surrounding nuclear weapon systems that emerged in the 1970s and 1980s, ranging from improved anti-submarine tracking and silencing, counterforce D5 missiles fired from submarines, the cruise missile and the stealth bomber, and improved command, control, communications, and intelligence capabilities, made little sense if strategic stability based on survivability was the primary goal. Why did the United States pursue these expensive and arguably destabilizing technologies? And why did the Soviets respond in kind, despite arms control efforts that appeared to reflect a desire for strategic stability? Some have suggested that it was bureaucratic or organizational politics, different branches of the military wanting the best and most expensive military equipment it could acquire. A better answer, however, could be found reflecting upon the first two puzzles: why fewer states have acquired the bomb than expected, and why the United States went to such great lengths, often successful, to prevent proliferation. Consider, for a state to forego their own nuclear weapons, they must believe the patron state is willing to use the bomb on their behalf. Establishing the credibility of this promise is difficult. By seeking nuclear primacy, i.e., better nuclear weapon systems than the Soviet Union, and by having strategies that allowed the United States to use nuclear weapons first, the United States and its leaders believed it increased the credibility of what is actually an incredible promise. If the United States had simply posited survivability as a goal, any other nuclear aspirant had little reason to believe that America's promise to defend it, and would have been very tempted to develop their own nuclear forces. Several lessons can be derived from the nuclear history of the Cold War. Nuclear weapons did revolutionize international politics. The kind of great power wars of invasion and conquest that plagued mankind for centuries has faded into the background. Even with increased geopolitical tensions between the United States and Russia and China, given the nuclear forces possessed by all three, it is hard to imagine a World War I or World War II-like scenario unfolding. That said, nuclear weapons have spread far more slowly than predicted, and the grand strategic priority of the United States has placed on preventing the spread of nuclear weapons has been relatively successful. Nor has the United States simply accepted survivability as a goal, as many scholars predicted decades ago. Will these circumstances change as new technologies emerge? This is a hard question to answer. If you told someone in 1960 that 60 years later, there would be less than 10 nuclear weapon states, that the number of overall nuclear weapons would massively increase, then decrease, that arms control would limit the numbers, but not the technological innovation pursued, and that nuclear weapons would not have been used, they probably would have been puzzled and certainly have been surprised. Perhaps most important, nuclear weapons appear currently to play a far smaller role in international relations. Is this because nuclear weapons and deterrence have become accepted and permanent features of the world order? And if this is so, is this something that can possibly change? Over the long run, of course, structural factors such as material wealth, geography, governance, and demographics are more likely to determine the pecking order in great power politics. Throughout history, however, new technologies and their innovative use have transformed the battlefield and, from time to time, upended the military balance of power. Historically, states competed ruthlessly to develop, adapt, defend against, and even steal new technologies to gain an edge in geopolitical competition. Innovative states can overcome weaknesses in other forms of power by developing innovative new technologies. Modern Israel is a compelling example. Nuclear weapons, unlike other technologies, had a contradictory effect on the overall balance of power. On the one hand, they are an enormously powerful military tool, providing its possessor with potentially unprecedented power to destroy its adversary. On the other hand, their power is so fearsome that it can cancel out every other form of military and non-military power. A state with a medium or even a small economy and a limited conventional military capability can, if it possesses a nuclear arsenal, deter a far larger, far more powerful state from attacking it. It is also the subject of much debate whether these weapons can do much more than deter and prevent an invasion. Can a state use a bomb for coercive purposes? And if so, what factors? The numbers of weapons, the amount of resolve, the stake in the contested issue, matters most in determining whether that coercion is successful or not. And what role does new technology play in these outcomes? When discussing nuclear weapons, it's important to take a broader view to analyze what might be called nuclear weapons systems. Atomic bombs are relatively old technologies, and since the development of thermonuclear weapons have not changed dramatically. Other technologies involving the ability to deliver weapons on a target or to discover, hide, or disable nuclear weapons have changed enormously and will continue to change. The effect of these changes on the military balance, grand strategy, and world order is contested and uncertain. American nuclear weapons systems went through at least two periods of profound technological change in the past. The first period came in the late 1950s and early 1960s with the development of intercontinental missiles and satellites. During the first decade and a half of the nuclear age, nuclear bombs were delivered by airplanes with varying degrees of range. Both the Soviet Union and the United States developed long-range missiles, long-range rockets, including intercontinental missiles, which allowed them to deliver atomic weapons quickly and from great distances. These missiles, in time, could also be fired from submarines, which were very hard to detect and track. Concurrently, the United States developed satellites, which in time provided a view into the location and number of nuclear weapons possessed by other countries. The second period of innovation came in the 1970s and the 1980s and largely affected nuclear delivery systems. Missiles became more accurate. An arms race began between stealth technologies that allowed weapons to elude detection with capabilities that were far better at locating and targeting nuclear weapon systems. One example was in the realm of nuclear weapons delivered by submarines, where the United States and the Soviet Union both worked to have their submarines escape detection and identify and target the submarines of their adversary. Command, control, communication, and intelligence capabilities also improved dramatically as well. Massive investments in defenses against incoming nuclear missiles had far more mixed results. What were the consequences of this qualitative nuclear arms race? Again, this is a contested question among scholars. In a somewhat contradictory way, some argue that it was both dangerous and destabilizing and a useless waste of money. Others argue that the Soviet efforts to keep up with massive American investments in nuclear weapon systems technology helped expose their deep vulnerabilities and contributed to the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. A less explored idea is that since the United States possessed such potent nuclear force, other states were dissuaded from improving their own nuclear weapons or pursuing nuclear weapons in the first place at all. We may be entering a third period of innovation in nuclear weapon systems. Improvements in stealth, detection, defense, miniaturization, speed, and accuracy continue. Computer processing capabilities have increased by orders of magnitude, allowing for far more complex, interconnected systems. Cyber, machine learning, and artificial intelligence may impact nuclear weapon systems. The United States is scheduled to spend over $1 trillion modernizing its nuclear weapon systems over the next 3 decades. Other nuclear powers are improving their capabilities as well. No doubt new technologies will emerge. A distinct feature of recent innovations is that they've been adapted to non-nuclear systems. Many of the advancements that emerged from the second and more recent period of American innovation in nuclear weapon systems have actually been utilized and exploited in conventional weapon systems and deployed in the battlefield. Since the first Gulf War, and escalating rapidly ever since, the face of the battlefield has been transformed by new technology, especially information capabilities, in ways that would have seemed unimaginable in the past. Some advanced conventional weapons, like long-range conventional strike capabilities, may be used to undertake missions and targets that have been reserved for nuclear forces or deployed in ways that make it unclear whether they are targeting an enemy's nuclear forces or our nuclear forces themselves. Many analysts worry that this blurring of what was once seen as a clear red line between conventional and nuclear forces will be destabilizing during a crisis. How will new technologies, in particular, massive increases in computational power and effectiveness, affect the balance of military power? Related but separate, how will these technologies affect the nuclear balance? These are complicated questions. Some observers are quite concerned. Henry Kissinger, who was one of the earliest scholars to recognize the profound consequences of the nuclear revolution, is quite worried about the impact artificial intelligence and machine learning will have on geopolitical and nuclear stability. The international order is, quote, is now in upheaval amid a new, even more sweeping technological revolution, whose consequences we have failed to fully reckon with, and whose culmination may be a world relying on machines powered by data and algorithms ungoverned by ethical or philosophical norms, unquote. As he and Eric Schmidt warned in another article, quote, if AI develops new weapons, strategies, and tactics by simulation and other clandestine methods, control becomes elusive, if not impossible. The opacity and also the speed of the cyber world may overwhelm current planning models, unquote. These are but a few things to bear in mind about cyber, artificial intelligence, and machine learning when assessing their potential impact on the military balance and stability. First, we should recall that these technologies are facilitating technologies. On their own, they're not instruments of violence for use on the battlefield, like tanks, battleships, or cannons. For the most part, these new technologies develop their military effectiveness in conjunction with kinetic capabilities. They enable kinetic force. Another characteristic is that these technologies are dual use, or perhaps more accurately, driven and developed far more and by the civilian sector. This makes regulating such technologies through arms control more complicated. Many of these new technologies are part of an increasingly interdependent set of networks that are featured of the globalized economy. This makes categorizing these technologies as purely national state capabilities difficult, as the Huawei situation is a good example of. These technologies offer other challenges as well. One of the keys to achieving nuclear deterrence was making one's own capabilities clear to the adversary. A state that hides or underplays its nuclear weapons capabilities risks losing those benefits. Exaggerating one's capabilities risks destabilizing international politics. Computational technologies, on the other hand, are far less transparent. It is hard to physically represent them without using them, and once they are used, adversaries can quickly develop countermeasures and adapt. It is also hard to imagine what arms control involving cyber and artificial intelligence would look like. Treaties limiting the numbers and kinds of weapons are easier to verify and measure than algorithms. Changes in technology have and will continue to shape both the strategic stability and shape of the international order. But two other forces matter as much, and perhaps even more, when it comes to questions of war and peace. The first are the changes in the international political order. In the years following the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was some hope that globalization and increased interdependence, combined with expanding norms, shared international laws, and strengthened international institutions, would dramatically decrease the dangers of conflict. In particular, there was an emphasis on reducing the dangers associated with weapons of mass destruction, particularly through arms control. Though by no means perfect, this period witnessed much success. Spending on militaries decreased worldwide, the number of nuclear weapon states decreased dramatically, and the spread of dangerous technologies was limited. Nuclear arms control between Russia and the United States, as well as efforts to strengthen the worldwide nuclear non-proliferation regime, were hallmarks of this effort. There is reason to worry that this era, marked by historically impressive levels of cooperation and coordination, may be over, or at least pausing, and that we've entered a new era, characterized by the return of great power rivalry and geopolitical competition. This era of renewed rivalry has several components. First is the intensification of regional rivalries and instability, especially in the Middle East, South Asia, and East Asia. Historical enmities have worsened, and the potential for nuclear rivalry with unknown consequences has reappeared. In the Middle East, Israel is the only state with nuclear weapons, but Iran has sought and may continue to seek nuclear capabilities, with Gulf states eyeing such developments warily. In East Asia, North Korea's nuclear weapons program has generated deep concern, especially in South Korea and Japan. Will those states seek the bomb? In South Asia, both India and Pakistan possess both bitter enmity and nuclear weapons. It is unclear how these regional rivalries will develop in the next few decades, but recent trends are not promising. These regional rivalries take place in the shadow of the return of great power political rivalry. America's relations with both China and Russia have deteriorated, and the trend lines are not promising. Russia has expressed a bitterness over a variety of American-led policies since the end of the Cold War, and its foreign policy under Vladimir Putin has become aggressive, witnessed by the seizure of Crimea and its intervention in Syria. It has also violated arms control treaties while embarking on its own nuclear modernization. China's rapid economic development, combined with its assertion of both regional and global great power status, has brought it into increased competition with the United States. How will the United States respond to both these regional and global challenges, and how will it affect international and nuclear order? This is another uncertain variable. The United States retains far and away the most powerful military and bedrock of alliances and security arrangements that arguably provide political international stability. It is also one of the keys to inhibiting the spread of nuclear weapons. The second important change is harder to grasp and quantify, but in the end, it may be more important. Nuclear weapons are increasingly seen as unusable, which may make them less relevant to international politics. Ironically, this may be due to the success of nuclear deterrence. The absence of nuclear war since 1945 has made the possibility of a planned nuclear detonation seem remote, if not impossible. Furthermore, global norms against not only nuclear use, but nuclear possession have increased dramatically around the globe. Nuclear deterrence, however, is premised upon at least the possibility that nuclear weapons would be used in extremis. While geopolitical tensions have increased, how states fight and what they fight for has changed. In the past, state power was based on the size of its population, its land, and its resources. States conquered other states to obtain these resources. In the 21st century knowledge economy, it's hard to see what role invasion and conquest plays. While nationalism and identity clashes may be on the rise, flattening demographics and aging populations decrease the state appetite for war. No state at present is remotely prepared to fight the kind of grueling wars of conquest, total mobilization, and attrition that marked much of the 19th and 20th century. Nor do any states seem eager to see that such a world return. Now, that doesn't mean such a world can't return. Of course, history tends to return and change with suddenness when you least expect it. Historically speaking, however, military budgets as a percentage of GNP are not high. The combination of a world living under a nuclear umbrella and integrated through globalization and supply chains constrains both what states want to do and what they can do in this world. It is also unclear what impact these new technologies will have on this situation. On the one hand, new technologies may be able to carry out military missions once reserved for nuclear weapons. Imagine this scenario. The United States launches a cyber attack to disable an adversary's ability to launch its nuclear weapons. In the past, such a preemptive, preventative attack could only have been achieved by launching a devastating nuclear attack with enormous casualties and damage. Such an attack would have been seen as deeply problematic at best and likely unthinkable. But what if new technologies allowed you to achieve the same result without a single casualty or even a damaged building? Strategic nuclear stability disappears in such a scenario, though it's not clear what the consequences are. New technologies may also make war less likely, perhaps by increasing intelligence about capabilities or shifting states to varieties of competition that may be as intense but are less likely to lead to the kinds of great power wars of the past. These new technologies offer one of the bigger grand strategic choices facing the United States. Will they replace nuclear weapons as essential military technologies of the future? If not, will they make it more or less likely that nuclear weapons can or cannot be used? Should the United States invest over $1 trillion over the next 30 years on nuclear modernization as planned, if nuclear weapons are less useful tools to achieve national interest? Might those funds be better spent on new technologies such as artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, automation, and robotics? And given the increasing hold of the nuclear taboo, would it be better to marry these technologies to the nuclear mission, or to separate this technology from nuclear weapons altogether? The changing technological landscape is, of course, critical to understanding the military balance of power, the stability in the international system, and the appropriate grand strategy the United States should pursue to achieve its goals and interests. After a somewhat static period, new capabilities are emerging that, on their surface, augur dramatic changes. In an uncertain world, it would be wise for the United States both to explore and develop these technologies, and also prepare for the global consequences of their development. That said, it is easy to overstate the role technology plays on these issues. Technology is only a tool that can be used to pursue interests. It doesn't shape these interests alone. One mistake nuclear analysts have made in the past was to analyze and assess the bomb on its own, separate from a state's political interests and goals in the world. Nuclear strategy, arms control, proliferation, non-proliferation, all were seen as shaped by the revolutionary, transformative effect of nuclear weapons. We now know, however, that politics did not go away, and that by examining what the goals of the United States and other nuclear and near nuclear, non-nuclear states were, and what they hoped to achieve either by acquiring the bomb or not acquiring the bomb, better helps explain what the security studies field may or may not have gotten wrong. Furthermore, there are broader trends in the international system, as I've alluded to, such as demographics and globalization, that work with nuclear deterrence to help reshape world order. It is not clear that the dramatic shifts in technology would necessarily overturn these other considerations. The most interesting question may be whether these technological advancements augment, replace, or are peripheral to the fundamental, important, but often uncertain role the nuclear weapons play, both in international politics and in American grand strategy. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions. Okay, first question from George. How, if at all, will Britain's departure from the European Union affect nuclear agreements within the European Union and between other global regions? This is a very good question. And the British nuclear effort has a fascinating and important history that's somewhat related to the American effort and also quite distinct. As you probably know, Great Britain was cooperated and collaborated during the Manhattan Project. In many ways, Great Britain contributed some of the greatest scientific advances. But as soon as the Second World War was over, a variety of American legislation froze the British out of the American nuclear planning and programming. And so Great Britain, for a variety of reasons, developed its own nuclear weapons. It's hard to recall, but in 1945, the assumption was that Great Britain was, if not as powerful as the United States and the Soviet Union, certainly within range and certainly one of the big three powers. It also had an enormous global empire, and which it saw as its foundation for power. And it also, because of its history with the United States, did not trust that the United States would be there to help defend British interests. The United States entered World War I and World War II years after Great Britain did. So it felt it important for its own sake to develop its own nuclear weapons. And an independent nuclear force has been a crucial aspect of British grand strategy ever since. What's interesting is that Great Britain now faces a challenge on that front. It's not a new challenge. Over time, Great Britain has relied on the United States for much of its technology and nuclear deterrent. It's submarine-based, and both the submarines and the missiles involve American technology and cooperation. And there have been various points in the 1960s, at points in the 1980s, and even more recently, where there's been some thought given and some political pressure for Great Britain to give up its independent deterrent, either because it could rely on the United States or because of the declining utility of nuclear weapons, or for any number of other reasons. But, and because it's expensive and it crowds out other military expenses in the British budget. But Great Britain has continued to plan to maintain and actually go through its own set of improvements, qualitative improvements, extraordinarily expensive improvements, to maintain its independent deterrent, which is an interesting question. How does that relate to the European Union? Well, as one probably knows through a little bit of history of this, Great Britain has always had an ambivalent relationship with the European Union. It was not a supporter when it was first created. Its first several efforts to get into the common market in the 1960s were vetoed. When it did enter the common market, it did not want to participate in the single currency. And so Brexit, even though it was a shock to many in 2016, was not necessarily completely out of line with traditional British politics. On the nuclear front, there has been some cooperation between the French and the British, not as deep as the cooperation between the United States and Great Britain. And I think in the same way that security problems in Europe are rarely viewed through an EU lens, but more often through a NATO lens, Great Britain views the nuclear question less through an EU lens and more through its particular relationships, particularly with the United States and increasingly over time France. France has in recent years once again talked about developing different nuclear arrangements that perhaps don't involve the United States as much as they have in the past, and the British have always sort of pushed this off. That's an excellent question. Okay, from Sophia. What are the most productive steps the US can take now in terms of the Iran nuclear deal? What role will the EU play? I think the most productive step that can be taken on all these fronts is to vote for Joe Biden in November. I think that most of the key foreign policy advisors in the Biden campaign are some of the people who were absolutely critical to negotiating that deal, people like Jake Sullivan, Bill Burns, Wendy Sherman. And a new Biden administration, I think, would certainly make efforts to perhaps not embrace the old deal, but try to see some way to reconstruct it. I think, like a lot of things in foreign policy, people are just waiting to see what happens in November. I think even in Iran, they're waiting to see what happens. I think it's been remarkable that the EU has managed to maintain elements of the deal, and the Iranians, even though they have pushed further and further on the outlines of what is allowable and what is not, have actually been arguably somewhat restrained on the nuclear front. And I think this is one of those areas where the election in November will matter a lot. I think if Biden wins, Vice President Biden wins the presidency, you'll probably see a concerted effort to try to reconstitute the deal. I think if President Trump is reelected, I think the odds of a nuclear Iran increase fairly dramatically. And I think in addition, you'll start seeing some of the Gulf states, like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, exploring nuclear weapons more seriously. From Truck, is the risk of nuclear war diminished with the increased risk of cyber warfare? It's a really interesting question, and it's something that like a lot of things, it pulls in two different directions. As I mentioned during the talk, one of the advantages, or one of the stabilizing aspects of nuclear weapons, is that you can see them. They're quite large, at least the means of delivering them in the nuclear weapon systems that have been developed. So through intelligence capabilities, we are able to develop a fairly good sense of the capabilities other states have. States can cheat, states can hide, but it's really hard to hide lots of elements of a nuclear weapons program. And through intelligence capabilities, we can see these things. Cyber, of course, is more difficult. Cyber is less a kinetic, measurable, observable capability than a more ephemeral one. As I said in the talk, it's harder to understand or see an algorithm. Furthermore, deterrence is based largely on demonstrating your capabilities. You say, I have these nuclear weapons, and if you do these bad things to me, this is what the consequences will be. With cyber capabilities, there's a far greater incentive to keep it secret, to hide your capabilities, which means it's hard to deter. And there's a variety of reasons for that. One, because when you use those cyber capabilities, you've demonstrated what you can do, and then an adversary can adapt very quickly. There's also some concern, as I alluded to in the Schmidt and Kissinger article, that artificial intelligence capabilities, which can do a lot of really amazing things, particularly on the intelligence front, as I showed in that one slide, identifying things. One worries that the lack of control over it somehow may lead to an inadvertent or a mistaken use of nuclear weapons. So it's hard to really know. I would say that they're certainly an unnerving capability. And I think that the other problem with cyber capabilities, unlike nuclear capabilities, is the one of attribution. Our ability for nuclear forensics to figure out where a nuclear device came from is pretty sophisticated. A cyber attack sometimes is much more difficult to figure out. So it just adds further confusion to it. So I think on the whole, it makes the picture cloudier, which potentially makes it more unstable. Do you think that it would be possible for AI and cyber weaponry to ever be subjected to the same scale of regulations as nuclear weapons? It's another really good question. I think that this is a real challenge for some of the reasons that I mentioned. First is the difficulty. Ultimately, AI and cyber have both a hardware component and a software component. And you can regulate the hardware component. We've done that in the past with supercomputers. But regulating, monitoring, limiting software is a bigger challenge. It's not undoable. One can imagine, certainly in the world of bioethics, people have thought about regulating some of the things one might do sort of in genetics and in biology, but it's a far more challenging proposition. There's also the issue of verification. As I mentioned earlier, the good thing about nuclear weapons from a verification standpoint is that you can see them, whereas cyber and AI capabilities are harder to locate. The other challenge, though, is that, as I mentioned, these are dual use capabilities. We are in the midst of a revolution in machine learning and artificial intelligence. The consequences will be profound, but many of them will be very good. You can imagine, say, in health systems, in personal monitoring of health through an AI system, all sorts of benefits that might come from that. You can think of all sorts of areas where artificial intelligence and machine learning will make life easier, increase productivity, improves the use of health, energy, transportation. And so one wants to be careful about limiting the development of these capabilities that have many benefits while being aware of the potentially difficult ones. And Dr. Kissinger and Dr. Schmidt have highlighted some of the ethical conundrums of machine learning and artificial intelligence, not just in the security world, but also in the realm of just day-to-day life. Are we comfortable with machines having the capacity to develop the ability to change their minds and outside of the control of human intervention? And this is an important set of both regulatory and ethical and arms control issues. And the other issue is, of course, that these capabilities, since they're developed for the civilian sector, are largely developed by private sector companies. And so how then do you think about regulating them? This is not to say it can't be done or that it's not necessary. It's just that the sort of intellectual work that went into thinking about nuclear arms control in the 1950s and early 1960s at places like Rand and at universities like Princeton and Yale, that kind of new sort of thinking is desperately needed today. Okay. From Brad. What relationship exists between regime type and technological adaptation? Have authoritarian states thought differently about new technologies and nuclear deterrence than democratic states? It's a really good question, and I can think about this in a couple ways. I think that as a historian, one thing is striking at looking at the earlier nuclear age is how quickly the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons and then thermonuclear weapons. Now, there's no doubt that some of it was done through espionage, but it's also pretty clear that there was a very vibrant, impressive scientific and engineering community there. And though ultimately American technology was better than Soviet technology, there were times where it was pretty close. And when you look at something like the Sputnik satellite, the ability to launch a satellite in outer space, the Soviets were ahead. This dilemma comes through even more clearly with the People's Republic of China in the late 50s and early 1960s, where you have a society that was going through great trauma, first with the Great Leap Forward, and then the Cultural Revolution, both of which combined killed tens of millions of people and disrupted the country. And despite that, China was able to first detonate a nuclear device, then develop a thermonuclear device, and then develop intercontinental ballistic missiles, which in some ways is harder when you think about the ability to develop an ICBM. And so any skepticism about authoritarian states, even authoritarian states in chaotic circumstances, not to develop new technologies, one probably has to give pause to that. North Korea is a perfect example of that. North Korea has been, if an authoritarian state decides to devote resources and capital to a particular technology involving its security, then it can achieve great results or impressive results. That said, I do think there are limits. I think one of the big questions many of us in the international relations field are wrestling with is China's public commitment to become the world leader in artificial intelligence capabilities. And this can be argued in a number of ways. There are some people who say that an authoritarian state, by being able to shift resources around according to national priorities, has an advantage over a democracy, which tends to be messy. It's hard to get political consensus. Technology is driven by the private sector for profit. And so in the end, this becomes very difficult. There's another argument, which is that particularly in a technological race as it advances, technological innovation is more likely to take place in a decentralized environment where there's a culture that rewards innovation. And what we know about innovation is that it's more likely to take place in environments that encourage dissent, creativity, unusual ways of looking at things. And I think, one of the ways of thinking about this is the effort of lots of countries around the world to replicate Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley, which developed a lot of technologies that actually were not unrelated to the defense industry, didn't just have the best technology. It had a culture, sometimes a hippie culture of sort of innovation. You think of someone like Steve Jobs and the success of Apple. The creativity may have had less to do with the technology as it had to do with the sense of purpose and style. And all of this is a way of saying that it's not entirely clear to me that just because China says it's going to win in AI, it will be able to win in AI. It's a good question. I probably confused you more with the answer, but my assessment is that authoritarian states are able to get 2/3 of the way there far more impressively than we would imagine. But for that last third of the way, I would rather have some of the assets that a democracy has: institutions of higher education, robust private sector, a culture of innovation. And I think in the end, that probably provides advantages. From Lucy. Do you imagine efforts will be undertaken by the US to limit the power that the president have over nuclear weapons? This has been a big debate, obviously, because I think there's a lot of concerns about the current occupant of the White House. The US does have a very strange system, and given that I only have 4 minutes left, I don't really have fully time to go through it. But because of the way, early on in the nuclear period, before the United States developed this large nuclear infrastructure, the military was actually kept far away from nuclear weapons. And it was only over time, as a particular type of strategy was developed, one that was related to its strategies of inhibition to extend deterrence, that the need to make very quick pre-delegated decisions was baked into the system. And this ended up putting enormous authority in the hands of the President of the United States. I think we all see this as a relic of the Cold War, and one that needs to be changed, and one that hopefully will be changed. And I'm actually, frankly, more surprised there hasn't been more discussion of this, because regardless of who is the occupant in the White House, that need for an immediate and massive decision to use nuclear weapons, which had some logic at the sort of darkest days of the Cold War, that logic is gone now. So there certainly should be, and there is some discussion of this in the academy, but less of a discussion in the policy world than one would think. I believe I have time for one more question. From John. What events would trigger a nation to use its nuclear weapons? What indicators can we look to see if these events are about to occur? I am of the belief that in terms of the United States, that there's almost nothing that would cause the United States to use nuclear weapons. Of course, as I mentioned, these were best seen of as invasion insurance. The United States has not really had to worry about invasion for some time. There was a concern throughout the Cold War of a bolt from the blue that the Soviets would launch a secret nuclear attack, a surprise nuclear attack. A lot of this was based on a misreading of what had actually happened during Pearl Harbor. I find it hard to imagine, even if, let's say, a rogue state or a terrorist group tried to detonate a nuclear weapon against the United States, one could imagine us perhaps using nuclear weapons. But I actually think we have capabilities, conventional and non-kinetic, that we would probably use beforehand. I think that the area that most worries me, the two places that most worry me are North Korea. And actually, what I most worry about is not North Korea against South Korea, or North Korea against the United States. I actually worry about North Korea against Japan, because I think there would be a calculation that no one would come to Japan's defense. But I think the greater concern is in South Asia between India and Pakistan, where both have in recent decades increased not just their nuclear capabilities, but developed doctrines that make nuclear use still not likely, still remote, but more likely than they had been in the past. And I think the key to think about is wherever there's an underlying geopolitical dispute, particularly over territory, and nuclear weapons are involved, those are the places that are most worrisome. So the area I think most nuclear experts worry about more than is India and Pakistan. Well, we've reached 1 o'clock. These have been tremendous questions, and I've really enjoyed my time here with you. So thank you very much.